There's an old saying, they don't build them like they used to. Of course, it's a ridiculous saying, but let's indulge it. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a rant. This is something that has sort of been bothering me, building up in me for a very long time, as it does with many things. And I think the reason that I finally want to talk about it is because I think in recent videos I've been talking a lot more about the post-war Starfleet and the potential 25th century Starfleet, trying to work out what does that Starfleet look like? What does the Starfleet of the 25th century actually have to its name? What does it make sense for it to have? And the thing is that you reach a certain level in thinking where you end up going, well, okay, what is the Starfleet of the 25th century facing? What does it have to go up against? And so, of course, naturally, you look for Romulan and Klingon ships of the 25th century. And while we'll deal with the Romulans another time, there's a whole can of worms over there, mostly around Hobus, which I do have thoughts on, although what I can say is that I have very concrete thoughts regarding the Klingon fleet of the 25th century and why it doesn't work for me. I think ultimately what's brought this on is the wonderful Admiral Horton on DeviantArt. He's been publishing orthos from all sorts of ships, but including Klingon ships in STO. And the thing that I've noticed, there's a very subtle thing that I've noticed, and that is it's all down to basically geometry. I don't like the geometry of these ships. Now, that might sound insane, and don't worry, this is going to get insane. Permit me to talk about this in a way perhaps better suited for this kind of topic. I'm going to do a little stint as Klingon Tucker Carlson. Used to be that torturing your enemies, massacring civilians, were good and glorious and honourable things. Not anymore. Not since the reformists had their way. Now that's a war crime, apparently. Used to be, Klingon ships were strong and masculine. What happened? What is going on? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. It all really goes back to the 2290s. That's where everything went wrong, isn't it? That's where we made peace with the Federation. And who made that peace with the Federation? Wasn't General Chang, was it? No. It was a woman. It was Azat Burr, a woman who made peace with the very people who killed her father. That's the kind of leaders we have these days. Look at the ships that have been built under Kempek's rule. The Kamarag, a ship that's named after a diplomat. Oh yes, that's going to instill fear in our enemies. Whatever happened to good, real Klingon designs? Whatever happened to real men? Well, let's find out. Okay, so rant over. I think I've made my slightly unhinged point, and it is completely unhinged where I'm going with this, because you're going to say that you're pointing at things that no one really notices and no one really cares about, and I'm going to say, yes you do, it's just subconscious. You don't notice it, but your brain does. So what am I talking about? Talking about geometry. Primarily what I'm talking about is perpendicular versus acute, and curves versus straight lines. Let's take a look at the ultimate example of this, the D7, the original Klingon Battlecruiser, the D7. And why does that design work? Why is it so aggressive? Why is it so just visually distinctive and impressive and threatening? And I would say that it is because of the angles at play. And also I think, and this is something that STO has definitely forgotten, it's the length to width ratio. You look at the D7, and we have our head here, and then the line goes back. But actually, when we get to the secondary hull, it doesn't actually sweep back. It actually slightly curves forward. It's actually a little bit concave forwards, if that makes any sense. And then it does sweep back, but it sweeps back at quite a sharp angle. And then we get to the actual nacelle pylon, and actually that cuts back the other way to form about a 90-degree angle. It's a much more aggressive look It's leaning forward. The D7 leans forward. It's not balanced like the Constitution. Look at the Constitution class. That is a balanced design, right? You've got equal distribution of mass across the entire ship's hull. The D7 pushes it forward. And this is where I think an interesting comparison can be made in STO. Because a few years ago now, I think, I did a video talking about the Moog and Kurak class. And I kind of talked about the Kurak in a sort of secondary way, which I kind of regret. Because actually, I really, really like the Kurak. I like it a lot. I really like the Kurak. I love the Kurak. I think it's brilliant. I think it's one of the most intimidating looking ships out there. I think it's just such a good design. Especially for a 25th century Klingon ship. Now, people are going to say I've been accused of having a bias. I like hammerheads. Maybe I do like hammerheads. Maybe that's my thing. Regardless of that, you can see a very clear difference between the Moog and the Kurak. It's not just the front that's different, it's also the wings that are different. And primarily the difference is in the sweep of the wings. So you have your head, and then we go backwards. Let's also bear in mind the head of the Moog, it curves back. It's very Vulture-esque, so it curves back like a nose cone, whereas the Kurak is open. It's open and it's actually angled sort of forward, if that makes any sense. That's interesting. Then we have our line. We have our line going back to the engineering section, and then we get to the wings of the Moog, and those just go boop, straight out. It's kind of boring. You compare that to the Kurak. The Kurak, what happens here is the wings then sweep forward again. They reach forward. And it's a lot more intimidating, and it gives a lot more energy to the design as well. It gives direction to it. This is a ship that goes forward, not just kind of sits there and does its thing. And you can actually see this kind of difference in language. Which is the more intimidating ship? Put aside in your brain, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, well, one is bigger and scarier than the other. But put that aside for a minute. Just look at the shape of the Vocha and look at the shape of the Negfar. Look at their silhouettes. And ask yourself, which is more intimidating? Which is the more aggressive looking? It's not the Vocha. I'm being somewhat obtuse about this. There are many Klingon ships that I like in STO, and not all of them are hyper-aggressive like the Kurak. But I think equally they still have elements that kind of demonstrate why they work, that kind of feed into this working theory that I have, that it's all about angles and sweeps and curves. So the Camarag, I like the Camarag, but I like the Camarag primarily. It's obviously a pretty looking ship, but the main reason I like the Camarag is because of what it is as a historical artifact. It communicates its time period extremely well, and so it makes sense for the Camarag to be this sort of more passive design. That's fine, because of the era that it's being built in. A similar thing with the Vocha. If we're sticking to other STO designs, though, we also have the Norg Bird of Prey, which I really like. Interestingly, there's a couple things going on with the Heavy Bird of Prey, or the Norg. Yes, it has a sort of back sweep on the wings, but you also have it sort of basically got this kite shape going on, and so you've got an equal amount of the ship going forward as it does backwards. It's not quite as aggressive looking as the Bird of Prey, which does have a very pronounced forward sweep, but it sort of evens things up and makes sense for something that's meant to be a little bit larger. Another ship, obviously, that I've talked about is the Vorkang. On one level, much like the Vocha that precedes it, it's got that kind of curve, but the difference being is that the engines actually crook forward, again, D7 style, and that just makes that tiny bit of difference. It's still not super aggressive, it's still a relatively passive design. That's a good example of where you can have both. You can have those sort of long, smooth curves, and then you can also have a sharp angle, and still get quite a good looking ship out of it. I will say that the big help for the Vorkang is its head section. Has a lot going on. There's this that I'm not exactly sure what it's called in game. called Klingon Battlecruiser, but this I like. I think this is a really good design. I like that forward sweep. Feels maybe a bit batwing, but it's something slightly different. Another STO variant that I quite like, and that people are going to bring me up on as a hypocrite, is this thing that's called the Katinga Retrofit. Why is it called that? I have no idea. Given what it looks like, it looks nothing like a Katinga. I call it the L5 Swan, and that also should give you a bit of an indication about where in the timeline I would put it. Once again, people are going to say, well, that has a sweep back, and yes, it does. It does have a very strong sweep back. I would also say it's not a curve, which means that it's still a very harsh line, and also it's exceptional. I don't think I necessarily have a problem with sort of Klingon ships that are perhaps not forward-leaning. I have a problem when it's the entire fleet. They're just not aggressive enough these days. That's the problem with Klingons these days. Bloody young people these days. They're simply not aggressive enough. They're not going and drinking lots of blood wine and eating raw meat and hitting each other's heads. Far rather play on the holodeck than engage in those healthy, useful activities that we did. I'm sure there was no negative effects of any of that. This is the thing, it's like, there are variants in STO, as I say, like the Kurak, but the problem is that they're few and far between, and there's just an awful lot of ships that are just passive. And actually, I think a good example is on Admiral Horton's DeviantArt page. So prior to publishing all these Klingon battleships of the 25th century, you know, the Bortasku and the Dovku and the Pegu, the Moog, all of those, he posted what's called the Warblood class, which is sort of a Negvar but wider. And that works. That works very well as a Klingon battleship. You know, it sort of implies a greater scale given its greater wingspan. And that's another thing, as it comes back to the length to width ratio. Again, I know this sounds like crazy pseudoscience nonsense, but I think there is something, you know, subconscious to it that we recognize. And when we see a ship that presents a wider front, obviously that looks more aggressive. We associate wideness, width, with strength and robustness and all that sort of martial stuff, which is of course very much lacking in a lot of these modern Klingon ships that just seem also firmly locked into trying to be as long as possible, probably so that they can, you know, keep pace with the other contemporaries of the 25th century, which are also very long. But of course, Klingon ships have never been as long as their contemporaries. They've always been, relatively speaking, a little bit shorter and a little bit wider. And that's what gives the Klingon fleet its aggressive, predatory profile. And I think it's the lack of these elements, correct length to width ratio, sharp angles, overuse of curves. I think it's those things that make the Klingon designs of STO, at least in my opinion, makes most of them so bland and just meh. Doesn't strike fear into the heart, doesn't echo of the great glory days. It's all just a little bit bland. But this is my own unhinged, crazy opinion. What's yours? Let me know in the comments below. Do you like Klingon ships in STO? Are there perhaps some examples that I've missed out that you think are actually good alternatives? Are there ships other than STO? You know, obviously these days, all everyone ever talks about is STO. Are there, you know, classes from fan games or just, you know, fan design classes for those time periods? I'll give a quick example, actually, off the top of my head, from the Journal of Applied Technology, and that is the D70 or Kinva, which is supposedly a post-war design. You can see that it very much still possesses the curved design elements that were picked up during the 24th century, but instead these curves come forward. It now looks quite sharp and bladed, like that of a bat'leth. And I think the Kinvar is a good example of how you could perhaps design a modern Klingon battleship. In many ways, this design actually feels kind of like a return to the 23rd century. I don't know if that's just because of the gunmetal hull or if it's because of this sort of general curve, but there's something very modern about it, but also something very old about it, which I quite like. So there's my submission, but if you have suggestions, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video.
I don't like putting chemicals in the bloodline that turn the freaking togs gay. Do you understand?